でも勝つ。何としてでも生きる。
Yo, what's good, Time Clan? It is your boy KingTitanX here. You know, the narcissist himself. And basically, what we have today is, what if Naofumi was a legendary dragon hero? So, of course, things are going to work very, very different in this timeline. You see, Naofumi would be rather different. His physiology and everything would have been completely different from his original self. And here, Naofumi, he would have been born to the dragon tribe, and where he would find himself having scales, golden eyes, fangs, claws, and wings as well. You see, there was one issue with Naofumi though. Despite having all of these features, despite having wings, and to be more specific, he had a disability of sorts. Unlike the rest of his race, he wasn't able to fly. His wings were non-functional even when he used his battle aura in order to amplify his physical abilities. Naofumi would have been mocked at for this. He would have been labeled as a failure of the sort by his people. He would be forced to work menial jobs that no one else would take due to his inability to fly as well. Flight was something especially desired in his society after all, or practically needed. So for somebody who wasn't able to fly, it was embarrassing. People didn't believe that Naofumi would amount to anything with him being unable to fly and all, but he did plan on proving them wrong somehow. By the time Naofumi reached his race's equivalent of 20 years old, he had managed to establish some form of strength for himself that his race could somewhat respect. He found that he always fell behind though, since those who could fly, well, they would usually be hunting dragons and the like, for crying out loud. Naofumi, on the other hand, he was just carrying boulders. Naturally, it made sense that those who could fly, they would be the ones to have the advantage here. Naofumi wished every day that he had the ability to fly, just so that he could keep up with the rest of his race, but he was just dealt a bad hand in this life. But maybe, just maybe, it would be different in the next life. Or maybe he would be able to finally awaken the ability to fly, although it was a long shot. Naofumi, he would witness something disastrous happen one day. A giant beam of energy. It began to consume his area. It seemed like it was consuming everything, to be honest. Many people were trying to run. Naofumi would also try to run in this case. But there was one issue. The beam was closely approaching him and he wasn't fast enough. He wasn't as fast as other people. Sure, he considered himself to be a good runner, considering how he practically needed to be able to run in these sort of circumstances where many others in his race, they could fly. So running was the only other option that Naofumi really had. But even now, it seemed as if all of that speed built up over the years, it was pretty useless against this beam of energy, because it would actually end up consuming him as well. Naofumi, at this moment, he would have thought that this was the end, that he was dead, but instead he would find himself on the floor the very next moment. He would feel himself and be surprised. He was alive, or at least seemingly so. He would pick himself up from off the floor and look around. He was confused as to where he was. The last thing that Naofumi remembered was, well, getting enveloped in that expanding beam of light. Naofumi, he would notice 3 others while he was looking around that were in the same room as him. But there was one thing off about them, well, besides their appearance anyways. There was the fact that they were holding weapons. A spear, a sword, and a bow. Naofumi would find that he himself didn't necessarily have a weapon of note. Rather, he just had a gem embedded into his chest. The 3 other guys in the room, they would just stare at Naofumi. Once Naofumi noticed that they were staring at him, he would question why. They would apologize though, mentioning how they had just never seen anything like Naofumi before. He had scales, golden eyes, white hair, well, not white hair, black hair. Well, the hair was probably the only normal part about Naofumi. Everything else just screamed a different species. Naofumi was about to ask what they meant by that. What exactly did they mean by never seen anything like him before? But he will be interrupted by a priest coming into the room, mentioning how they were the great heroes. And well, the king apparently wanted to have an audience with the 4 of them. They will be escorted over to the king's throne room, where they will be introduced to King Oldcray. After an explanation of there apparently being waves in this world, which the heroes, well, they needed to protect the people of Melormike against, the heroes, they would question why they should help. Naofumi would be the only one out of the whole group to remain silent though. The king would settle everyone down by explaining how each of the heroes would actually receive the greatest of treasures if they managed to defeat the waves. The king had no problem giving them the greatest of riches after all. They would deserve it after defeating the waves. Just being able to protect the people of Melormike, the king would be eternally indebted to the heroes. The heroes, I like the sound of it, and he would go on to actually ask about their names and get to know each other on a one-to-one basis, you could say. The other 3, they would introduce themselves, but the king would interrupt Naofumi when he was about to introduce himself. He would stare at Naofumi in confusion. He wondered where the shield hero was, and if this guy was summoned in his place. Well, then again, if this guy was summoned in the shield hero's place, that honestly wouldn't be too bad in the king's opinion. It meant that they no longer had to worry about the devil of the shield arriving in this place. This holy grounds, you could say. The king just had a vendetta against the shield hero, and this guy coming in, well, he didn't hate this guy necessarily, but he would stare at Naofumi with contempt. He would question why a monster like Naofumi was here. Naofumi would be confused as to what the king meant. He would explain, or at least try to explain, that he was not a monster, but rather he was of the dragon tribe. The king refused to hear a word from Naofumi though. He refused to listen to Naofumi, and he would just command for his guards to escort Naofumi out of their premises. Ren, Itsuki, and Motoyasu, they would try to argue with the king though for his treatment of Naofumi. Oldcray, he would just silence all of them by explaining that Naofumi, he wasn't necessarily a real hero. He was nothing more than a monster that deserved to be treated as such. He would fit in more with the demi-humans of anything, even if there were probably still a couple of differences. The heroes disapproved of the king's philosophy, but he would shut all of them up by offering them an extra 500 silver to their wages if they just kept quiet about this whole situation. The heroes hearing this would be rather enticed and quickly shut their mouths. Naofumi, he would actually be thrown out of the castle with only the clothes on his back to his name. He would pick himself up off the floor. It seemed like he was finding himself on the floor quite a bit today. And he would leave to explore this new land. After all, he had never heard of a place such as Melramite, so it seemed like he was really teleported away from his homeland. He would encounter some balloon monsters on the way, but using his claws, he would easily pop them. A status bar would actually appear though, showing Naofumi his progression though. Currently, he was at level 1, and that by destroying these balloon monsters, he would gain XP. Naofumi, he saw this status bar as a form of foreign object. He would try to touch it, but it would just phase through, or at least his hand would phase through the screen. Naofumi would be very confused. He came from a very primitive land, you could say, so something like this was completely new to Naofumi, but he would try to get adjusted to it. He also figured that maybe he could become even stronger here through this leveling system of sorts than he was back in his old world. Maybe he could become faster, stronger, who knows, maybe he could even fly in this world. Naofumi, he would just destroy several more balloon monsters and make it up to around level 3 off of these guys alone. Eventually his progression was beginning to slow down, so he decided to go hunting for more monsters. These silly balloon monsters, they were getting rather boring to deal with, so he just continued to explore, finding more monsters. He didn't have any money to his name, so he had nothing else to do but hunt for his food. Some of the scraps he would realize though that he could well sell in order to make a quick buck. Most merchants, they would be hesitant at first, considering Naofumi's appearance, but they would be lying if they were to ever say that he didn't bring in valuable items. In their opinion, it would be a waste to refuse his service off of just his appearance alone. Naofumi, he would eventually be able to rack up a good couple hundred silvers, although he had yet to use any. The reason being, well, he didn't really need to, and that he was still getting used to the currency of this world. He was simply observing for a while, but he felt like he was starting to get a bit of understanding, but there was still a couple of things that he was kind of confused about, or maybe he was just overcomplicating it. He wasn't exactly sure just yet. Naofumi managed to make it up to level 7 on his own by the time a strange man would approach him. This strange man would appear to Naofumi in the middle of the night, and he would offer Naofumi a proposal of a lifetime. This proposal being, well, that he could probably have something to help him with his travels. He was a hero after all, or so we heard, and the hero needed party members. Naofumi, he would deny it at first, but the man would ease Naofumi into his mindset. He would explain to Naofumi that he could only get so far on his own. Naofumi was strong, yeah, but, well, no man was a one-man army. You see, having somebody else fight alongside Naofumi would allow for Naofumi to continue to level up as well. probably at an even faster rate since there was going to be a second set of hands helping him fight off the monsters. Naofumi would follow the slave trader to his base of operations after hearing the slave trader's reasoning. Naofumi would be offered a variety of slaves, only to find that, well, most of them were pretty much too expensive. They were out of his price range for him to even consider purchasing. So he would decide to settle for the cheapest one out of all of them, this being a sick demi-human girl. The slave trader, he would try to insist on Naofumi reconsidering, maybe look at some better slaves that he had at hand, but Naofumi would just shoo the slave trader away, explaining that he was going to go with this slave and this slave only. Naofumi had begun to gain an understanding for the currency in this world, and by this moment he realized that he was most likely just overthinking it for a while now. It was honestly pretty similar to his own world the more he observed it. So he would decide to buy the girl off of the slave trader, but he would stop the man from adding a slave mark onto the girl. Now for me, he would explain his reasoning being that he had no purpose for there to be a slave mark on a girl since he wanted her as a teammate. Nothing more, nothing less. The slave trader, he would accept this reasoning from Naofumi, and the two would just be on their way from there on. Naofumi would buy the little girl a small knife from a weapon shop owner by the name of Erhard. He would also buy her some medicine after another successful hunt and being able to sell her corpses for a reasonable amount. He noticed that when it came on to Raftalia, she was sick from the day he had met her. And, well, he just couldn't afford for her to be sick after all. He needed this girl to be at 100% health if she were to ever become an effective party member. Naofumi would have Raftalia join him more often on his hunting expeditions once she began to get better. She would be a bit fearful at first, considering how, when it came on to some of these monsters, they bled, but Naofumi, he would force the girl to get over this mindset really fast. Naofumi would even give Raftalia an ultimatum at one point. If she wanted food for the day, well, she would have to hunt and kill a monster on her own. Raftalia would settle for a rabbit-like monster and stamp through them. Blood would gush out to the creature, but Naofumi, he would applaud her for her efforts, setting up a fire to actually cook the rabbit monster. They would go on to kill a couple more monsters that were similar to the rabbit monster that they had just faced, and they would sell parts that they didn't eat afterwards. Naofumi, by the time he had reached level 15, managed to unlock something he had missed for a while now. This being his battle aura. It felt unusual not being able to use it after being accustomed to, well, using it in his fights for so long now in his old world. In this new world, it had put several restrictions on him, even limiting his strength. But Naofumi figured that through this leveling system, he could regain all of that strength and more. So Naofumi would continue to explore the land, racking up quite a bit of money alongside Raftalia, but the two would end up finding themselves exploring a cave one day. It had been affected from the wave, and where there were apparently some dangerous creatures, but there were also really valuable ores there. Some very valuable ores in that cavern. So Naofumi and Raftalia, they would decide to explore, willing to take their chances here. They would end up encountering a two-headed black dog on the way though, and they were trying to attack the duo. Raftalia, she would freak out seeing the monster because, well, it gave her PTSD, or well, it triggered her PTSD, I should say. It reminded her of the monster that killed her parents, although that dog was more of a Cerberus and where it had 3 heads. This dog just looked very similar to the one that killed her parents, and Raftalia, she would begin to freak out. Naofumi would be very confused and kind of concerned since he had noticed that she had become a lot more confident these past couple of days, but all of a sudden it just seemed as if she had gone backwards in development for some reason. Naofumi, he would charge his battle aura around his fists, using his fang technique in order to break through the defense of the monster. He would greatly weaken the monster on his own, but he would force Raftalia back onto her feet afterwards. He would explain that she needed to kill this beast right here, right now. It seemed that the monster had some effect on her mental state, so he figured that the best way for her to get over it though would be through killing this monster herself. Raftalia, she would be a bit hesitant, but she would plunge her knife into the monster's heart. This would be enough to put them down for good. Naofumi and Raftalia would go up in levels after that kill on Raftalia's part afterwards. To celebrate Raftalia's victory, Naofumi would use the saved up money to buy the girl a new weapon from Erhard. He could afford to buy her fairly high quality weapons at this point, so he would settle on buying her twin swords. Erhard would mention something about the wave though, wishing the two good luck. Naofumi would decide to question how they could find out more about the waves when the next wave would happen, and Erhard would be surprised that Naofumi was even asking him this question. He figured that Naofumi would have known already, but he would explain that they could use the dragon hourglass in order to tell how much time they had before the next wave. Naofumi would head over to the dragon's hourglass after getting a couple of directions from Erhard, and Naofumi would find himself meeting up with the other heroes as well. Interestingly enough, none of the heroes actually had much to really talk about though. Motoyasu, well, he would try to hit on Raftalia though, noticing her more developed body at this point in time. She was considered to be a grown adult by demi-human standards. Raftalia, she would be annoyed with Motoyasu's flirtatious advances at her, so she would simply grab one of her swords and place it close to the blonde's throat, telling him not to play lover boy with her. Motoyasu, he would sweat nervously. Ren and Itsuki, they wouldn't even pay much attention to Motoyasu. Instead, they were paying more attention to Naofumi, and where they would actually check his level. It was rather high. They wanted to ask him about how he was able to level up so fast, especially with only one member on his party, but they would be teleported over to where the wave was at that moment. While the other heroes, they went to immediately deal with the boss. Naofumi would decide to take Raftalia over to one of the nearby villages, Loot Village, in order to fight off the monsters there. He figured that the other heroes had the boss handled already, so he found that there would be no purpose in him joining. 3 heroes fighting off a monster was already good enough. Having a 4th hero face just one monster, well, that was pretty much overkill. He figured that it would be better to focus on establishing more connections, and by doing this, well, he would be protecting Loot Village. That would be the very first village he would really decide to work on building connections with. Now for me, he would use his claw technique in order to slice through the monsters. Raftalia, she would cut down her own fair share of monsters as well. The knights on the field, they weren't all that great of a help though, considering how they were about to burn down their village rather than protect it. Naofumi had to call them out though for this, even forced to use some magic from his other world in order to get the point across. He would use voice magic in order to disrupt the balance of the soldiers. It would paralyze them temporarily, just so they could stop with their attacks before they burnt the village to the ground. Naofumi, he would actually manage to protect Loot Village until the very end of the wave to celebrate their victory against the last wave though. King Oldcray would have an after party be formed with all of the heroes invited as well. Naofumi would attend simply because of Raftalia's request though. He didn't really want to be there after his first interaction with the king after all, but he figured that if Raftalia wanted to do it, then why not? He didn't mind all that much. He could hear some people whispering about him as well though. It was rather annoying, but he decided to keep a cool head here. This was all for Raftalia after all. She had been a really good partner throughout this journey in this world, and she deserved to have some fun. It was the least he could give her after basically forcing her to become his teammate. He was in a pretty good mood until Motoyasu decided to walk up to Naofumi and slap him with his glove. He reprimanded Naofumi for having a slave in his party. Naofumi would be quick to correct him though, explaining that Raftalia, well, you see, she wasn't a slave. She didn't even have the slave mic, so she could leave him at any point in time. It's just that she chose not to. Motoyasu, he wouldn't believe Naofumi though, believing that he was probably using an alternative method to trap the poor girl into working for him after Raftalia showed that she didn't have a slave mic on her. He refused to believe the possibility that Mine was lying to him. Naofumi was getting annoyed, well, even more annoyed than before. His anger would rise when he saw the guards grab and put a muzzle on Raftalia as well. The king would try to force Naofumi to duel Motoyasu in order to win back Raftalia. But Naofumi, he would refuse this time around. He wasn't having any of it. He would backhand Motoyasu and charge at the guards. He would use his superior physical strength to rip their hands off of Raftalia, and he would use his voice magic to paralyze them as well. Once again, Motoyasu, he would try to charge at Naofumi with his spear in hand, but Naofumi, he would swiftly grab the spear, yanking it out of Motoyasu's hands before headbutting the blonde and breathing fire in his face before hitting him with his own spear and kicking Motoyasu in the gut before beating him with his own spear once again. The other heroes were powerless against Naofumi. They knew better than to go up against Naofumi at this point. They were honestly quite fearful of Naofumi at this point. Naofumi, he would just take his leave with Raftalia afterwards, leaving behind the beaten squadron of knights and the wounded pride of Motoyasu. Motoyasu, he wanted revenge though. He wasn't about to just let Naofumi humiliate him like this. Naofumi may have ruled the night. Naofumi may have won this match, although through pretty dirty ways, you could say, at least in Motoyasu's point of view, but he was going to get his revenge one way or another. He just had to figure out a good time and how to get stronger before he were to face Naofumi, because he had to admit he did make a pretty foolish move trying to go up against somebody who was around 10 levels ahead of him already. But yeah, that's how I'm going to end part 1 for you guys. It's your boy KingTitanX signing out, and you guys already know the deal. If you like the video, maybe like the video, leave a comment, and the comments help the algorithm. Basically, the more comments and more likes on the series, the more likely it'll be shown to more people. Also, hit that subscribe button and share in case, well, YouTube just doesn't really do its job. And make sure to click that notification bell as well. Like, the reason why I'm asking you guys to share the video is, well, so that this can gather a bigger audience as well. So send it out to people that you know are into this sort of content. But yeah, it's KingTitanX out.